All right, friends, now for the moment you've all been waiting for, the Three Sisters Garden. What is it? Why are we using it? What are we growing? This video will answer all your questions and show you what we're up to. Hi everyone, this is Angie and Ben, and welcome to our homestead. Well, the first steps in prepping this bed were done several months ago. You can go back and watch an older video from this year. We were prepping beds for the growing season. We used an old pool cover and some other tarps to try to kill the grass and the weeds. If we had known far enough in advance, we could have prepped this bed over the winter when the grasses and weeds were dormant, but we didn't have that opportunity. We had this pool cover, this tarp. We covered it for I guess a few weeks, a couple months, and this is a pretty big bed to till with our small electric tiller, but we were able to get the job done, not tilling too deep. We do want to keep the biodiversity of the soil intact. You can see I'm tilling in a kind of crisscross orientation, really trying to get this grass out. It's really annoying grass. It creeps all around. It infests all of our beds and plots. And you can see I have to clean out the tines of this tiller pretty regularly because the grass just gets wrapped all around it. So while you watch us prep the land for this new Three Sisters garden, let me go ahead and tell you what the Three Sisters is and what our motivations are behind using that concept. To my knowledge, the Three Sisters garden kind of dates back to ancient Native American traditions where they're growing some sort of squash, green beans, and corn, all in the same small little plot. There's a number of configurations, whether you're doing rows or circles or just raised beds or whatever. But the way we did it was plant the corn, a couple weeks later, plant green beans around where the corn is planted. Then a few weeks after that, plant some sort of winter squash or pumpkin just on the outskirts of where you planted the beans. And the idea is, assuming you have the correct seeds for slow-growing corn, tall-growing corn and stuff, once the corn gets tall enough, the green bean vines begin to climb up the corn as if it's a trellis. You have to have pole beans for this because bush beans don't really grab on and go vertically. So the corn starts growing tall, the beans grow up the corn, and then once you have the squash and pumpkins planted, those leaves get really big and they kind of shade out the ground and keep the weeds away. And since the corn and the beans don't need the ground anyway, it gives you some vegetables, some produce at the ground level to grow. So besides giving you 3 different layers of crops for any particular garden plot, there's also some other benefits as well. In the gardening industry, at least the people that are trying to do it more sustainably, they're starting to realize the benefits of polycropping. There's other names for that too, but what that really means is that you're growing more than one crop or plant. It doesn't necessarily have to be a crop, it could be other plants as well, in each garden row or plot or bed or however you're growing. And there's benefits of that. When people are using the mainstream method of monocropping, it's very easy to rob the soil of specific nutrients, especially if you keep growing the same crop there over and over again. That's why large-scale farmers typically rotate crops, or at least till in some of their crops to kind of add more nutrients to the soil. One way around that is polycropping, where you're growing a diverse amount of plants in each garden bed, so nothing is taking all of any particular ingredient of your soil. And you can have different things in your garden like nitrogen fixers, which is what the green bean plant offers in our configuration, where you can actually grow plants that add things to the soil. And I'm not an expert in this by any means. In fact, this is a relatively new concept for me, and I'm new as a gardener. So If you are more interested in this concept, you should definitely do your own research. One thing I want to caution you about, though, is the amount of anecdotal information that there is out there. You might come across some stories of, or examples of, like an old farmer who happened to plant things near each other, and whatever the results are, they're not necessarily scientifically backed. So to find the science-based stuff, there's pretty limited resources now. It's starting to become mainstream. People are starting to understand what benefits you can have. But another thing to know is there's different motivations. Some people might be interested in keeping different nutrients or adjusting their soil nutrient levels with different plants. But another big reason to polycrop is to help with your pest problem. There is evidence out there that certain pests only attack certain plants. For example, there's like the hornworms and the cabbage worms like we get here in North Carolina. But what some people might not know is there's a lot of pests that will avoid certain crops. Maybe they smell bad or they don't like the taste, or a number of reasons. But if you can do the research and find out what pests you have and what plants they don't like, you can intermittently disperse those plants throughout your crops to try to protect them or to stave off those pests that you have. So we chose to grow the Three Sisters because we like the food. Also, our main primary garden got pretty full, and this was a way for us to grow 3 different crops in a new bed that frankly took us a lot more effort to build than we realized. And we also like the fact that this is an ancient Native American tradition, and we're kind of honoring the practices of our surrounding area. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's get back to the footage that you're watching. You got to see pretty high-speed time lapses of us preparing the ground, which involved the tilling. But what we also did was use the propane torch to try to kill any weed seeds that came to the surface. We also have a ton of mulch on the property, several truckloads that we got from a free chip drop. You guys should look into that if you're looking for free mulch in your area. We also purchased a truckload or 2 of this garden-ready compost from our local landscaping company. We used this as kind of a fertile ground to plant the crops in, but we did not till this into the soil like some people do. This is basically just the top area for the seeds to germinate in. I'm pretty OCD when it comes to lines, so I always run a string line to make sure our beds are straight. I like to have even walkways, even beds. Not necessary though. Just like the walkways, I do a string line to make sure our row of crops is straight. We borrowed this little seed inserter from a neighbor of ours. It seems to be for pretty long runs to kind of help reduce your labor and crouching down. We just used it as an experiment to see if we could plant our corn kernels in a straight line. After planting the kernels for our new popcorn variety stalks of corn, Angie gave the soil a thorough watering. We've used polyline before for irrigation, but we typically only use it for the supply line and then reduce it down to a 1/4-inch drip line for, like, say, a greenhouse or a bed. But in this case, we ended up ordering several rolls of 1/2-inch poly that already has a drip built in. So you can see here I'm rolling back the existing supply line that we had intended to use in this area, and then replacing it with the drip line. Two lines of drip line, one for each side of the bed, and both of them will create a loop which will allow water pressure to evenly go around the entire bed while dripping on both sides. In this particular garden, we use these screw-on connectors, which are actually reusable, so that makes it pretty nice for future flexibility in planning. You can take this irrigation system apart, hook it up to something else, expand the garden, put it away for the winter. There's a number of reasons to use the screw-on fittings. But in my opinion, they just work better than the ones that kind of stick on permanently. After a couple weeks of watering the corn bed by hand, I hooked it up to our new Beehive Smart Irrigation Controller. It's a pretty affordable controller from Lowe's that can handle up to 8 different zones. You just have to buy the solenoids and hook it up to some sort of PVC manifold or whatever you use for your water line to split off to go to your different garden beds. We love this controller because it can sense the weather using its internet connectivity, and it can delay the start of the irrigation if there's a storm coming or any number of criteria that you can set in the app. We can also start and stop our irrigation programs from wherever we are using our smartphones. Now that the corn is about a foot tall at the tallest sections, you can see Angie going ahead and planting the green bean seeds. After a couple weeks, the green bean seedlings now have their first true leaves on them. That means it's time to start planting the squash. We have 2 rows of corn in this new bed, 1 row of glass gem and 1 row of Amish mushroom. We go through a lot of popcorn in our household, so we decided that these should all be our popping corn variety. We've never done this before, so it's kind of an experiment. Like I said before, the green beans are a pole bean variety, and the intent is for them to coil up the corn stalks as they both grow around the same speed, and then the beans will be able to be harvested by standing upright and just kind of picking them off the corn. For our bottom layer of the Three Sisters combination, we planted a bunch of different squash, including some straight neck and other gourds, including some pumpkins, like fairy tale pumpkins and acorn squash as well. For the first couple weeks, I would help the green beans by wrapping them manually around the corn. From that point forward, they would stay on and coil up the rest of the way. Here's a panoramic shot of what the Three Sisters garden looks like after 3 months. You can see how it's pretty dense because the bottom space is taken up by the leaves of both the squash plants and the green bean plants. Here you can see up close how the corn looks. It looks about ready to pick. The green beans are tangled up all over them, and I guess that's how they're supposed to look. We haven't done this before. Here we're coming up to an acorn squash, I believe. It's the first one of these we've ever grown. It's also the first squash we have on our vines. Here's our nearby bed of cucumbers. You can watch how we planted those in one of our other videos. That's not part of the Three Sisters, but it seems to grow well with those other plants. And here's our first yellow squash. So that wraps up this video. Please like and subscribe, and leave a comment if there's anything you want us to explain further.